My name is Kyle Wilson. I'm an IT Enterprise Business Applications Architect with what used to be known as the Shared Systems Team and what will be known as the ERP System Support Team. That is a tentative name. No, it's not tentative, but it's a pending name change. In addition to my work here at Nelnet, I've been an organizer with the Lincoln Agile community, which is now called Agile LNK, for about 5 years. And before that, I studied and worked in Agile teams, doing Agile transitions at Nebraska Department of Roads, and at a small company in Lincoln called Bypass Technology Group. And also at Emeritus, which is an insurance company in Lincoln too. And now here at Nelnet, I work a lot with Agile. And just so you know, I've been working with Agile stuff for almost 20 years now. I still don't have it right, so if you're looking for that, perfection, good on you. So why are you guys here today? Well, the chances are that you guys are here because you're involved in some way, shape, or form with an Agile project or in an Agile transformation. Anybody here not working with Agile at all? All right, so considering working with Agile? Okay. Why do we want to work with Agile? Why do companies go to Agile? Because it's better than what they were doing before? It's faster? Safer? It's good that we're moving towards Agile because companies that embrace Agile deeply are actually more profitable and have greater revenue. We're going to talk about that more as I move forward here. In 2018, Harvard Business Review did a study where they determined that companies that really truly embrace Agile in a deep way throughout the organization are 60% more profitable. They have 60% more revenue. That's appealing, I think. There's a good business value behind moving towards Agile. To kind of reemphasize that, McKinsey & Company did research that shows that Agile organizations are more customer-centric. They have higher revenue and profit growth. They have lower costs. These are things that we all find appealing. But more importantly, or not more importantly, but as important, Agile, when it's embraced throughout an organization, leads to a better and more engaged employees. And these are all really important reasons that we should be looking at Agile, and I hope they're important reasons why you're looking at Agile. But the problem is, what we found as we look through these studies is that management isn't really that engaged. And that's a problem. For example, in the State of the Agile survey, version 1 does the State of the Agile survey every year. It's probably the biggest survey related to Agile and its health in organizations. They found that only 2%, the developers that work in Agile groups, think only 2% of the executives get Agile at all. And that's pretty telling, because if the developers who are doing this work, working in this way, work with executives who they think don't get it, they're probably not too far off. Meanwhile, in the executive and management levels, 78% of professionals think, hey, Agile's good, we should be doing that, except really only 35% are even doing it. It's a problem. So the question is, what is an Agile corporate culture? And how do we obtain that, if that's something we find desirable? The most important thing that I want you guys to take away from this is that we need to think of Agile as a philosophy that needs to be cultivated and not just a process that needs doing. Philosophy that needs to be cultivated and not a process that needs doing. If we can teach ourselves and our peers to adopt an Agile culture, the process or approach we use will come naturally. We won't have to think about processes all the time. And let me say that this applies whether you're talking about Scrum, whether you're talking about DevOps, whether you're talking about extreme programming, or whether you're talking about a waterfall project. Has anybody ever applied Agile to a waterfall project before? In Lincoln, I got sneers when I said waterfall. So, jeers. No, jeers is what I mean. Well, there were probably sneers too. So let's start talking a little bit about what it means to be Agile. So think about your first time, your first Agile project, your first Agile, this is it for you here. So how did you guys start doing Agile? Somebody want to share their first Agile experience with me? Yeah.
I had a really difficult customer who was constantly changing scope and priority on me in a traditional PMBOK delivery method. So we were never getting anything done. So once we introduced like the concept of here you're the product owner, you own the backlog, you can set priorities. Every 2 weeks you can shift them however you want. We were able to get through the project, get it done, and we had a much better relationship moving forward.
Did it go, I mean, you decided to do Agile and pop, you guys worked it out and everything went smooth after that?
No. I mean, there were growing pains as far as learning roles and responsibilities, because I was new to it as well. I had the benefit of having a manager who had just come from Microsoft, so had a deep Scrum background.
So you had somebody, you had a coach basically, somebody to lead you through it.
Yeah. And then we had Mike Cohn come in and talk to us too. So.
Well, having Mike Cohn come in is really kind of an advantage, isn't it? Somebody else want to share their first Agile experience and maybe what they do differently? Yeah.
So in 2014, when I got hired, we were one of the first teams in Highlands Ranch to start with a Scrum Master PO on the Workspace project. 100 sprints later, we were a little more formed and belonged.
Yeah, so what would you do differently in that?
I think it was probably being a single team, working at that, not an entire rollout, maybe helped. We were ahead of the initial trainings that were brought on by the contractors that came in and helped IT every year.
So bringing more people in with you along with that journey is one thing. So here's some things that I commonly hear when I hear, what would you do differently? Number one is, get buy-in, as you were talking about, and training, particularly in a larger group than we started with. Wouldn't use Framework X. A lot of times we talk about, oh man, Scrum, it just didn't work for us. I particularly hear that on non-development teams. A development team has come in and they've started using Scrum, and now they want to move that out, and so they get other teams using it, except it doesn't necessarily work for those other teams, as well as it does for the development teams. And there's kind of, the other thing a lot of teams I hear, they would focus more on what done is, because there's just a lack of communication about what done is between the teams, between the individuals. So there's often this focus when we adopt Agile on methodologies. In fact, when I joined Nelnet, the team I was working with, they didn't know the difference between Scrum and Agile. So there was a total confusion about that. And so this focus on frameworks brings with it an assumption that if you execute the specific set of steps that are outlined by a framework, you'll come up with a predictable result. Has anybody had that experience with their Agile? Predictable results? Follow the steps and you'll get exactly what that other team got? Nobody's shaking their head yes or no? Okay. That's not been my experience. And the reason for this is that no two projects are alike. No two teams are alike. The goals change from project to project. And so therefore the way that you need to execute that project cannot be the same. And if any of you have done PMI training and you've gotten your PMP, and you're supposed to follow this specific set of steps, and that will lead to project success, you know how frustrating that is. If we approach Agile with that same mindset, if you execute, if you have stand-ups, if you use a Kanban board, if you do your retros, You follow your burn down, you'll be as successful as us. If we have that approach, we're going to be in trouble. It's common to see companies implementing Agile in pockets. And that's what we heard back here, Agile in a pocket. A little group that was doing Agile, but the people around them were not. And when we view Agile as, as that pocket, if we think of it as something that Group A does, the developers do, or that IT does, what happens is, if IT is the only one working in an Agile fashion, the customers aren't, the executives aren't, the managers aren't, the customers aren't, then, or even if your vendor isn't, which we've had that problem before, what you wind up with is people rowing in different directions. You're only working with half the team. If the IT group is doing Agile, but the business team is not, we're going to be going in circles because you're working in two different directions. One of the experiences I had related to this was really important. We had a really good, solid Agile team working at the Nebraska Department of Transportation. It was one of the best Agile teams I've ever been a part of. And one component of that was that we took 2 hours every week to do training. Does that seem like a lot to anybody? Every week? So we worked with our customer, our business partner, and they said, you know what, this training is valuable, we want you to do it 2 hours every week. The director at the Department of Transportation found out that he had consultants and developers and others working 2 hours every week on training, and he was very frustrated. That's a total waste of time. And so he canceled the training. And within 2 months, I'd lost 2 of my most important team members. They were frustrated. It's an example of how, when you're not all on the same page, things can go awry pretty quickly. So, what does it mean to be Agile versus doing Agile? We need to become Agile. We don't just need to do it, but we need to become Agile. So what does being Agile look like? You guys all know? So you may know what it looks like in your environment, but what does it mean when the entire company is Agile? Let me talk about that a little bit. So when we look at what Agile has done for application development, this may seem pretty familiar to you guys. When I started doing application development back in the prehistoric days, this is what the systems development lifecycle looked like. You start with a business analyst, you bring in some architects, you do some designing, the developers would write code, the QA team would get involved in and do all your testing, and then after everything worked perfectly, you get into the deployment and have the infrastructure group deploy your system. Has anybody been through that process? Standard systems development lifecycle. What's the problem with that process?
No feedback.
No feedback. A lot of times what would happen when you got to QA? Everything would come off the rails, right? So what Agile did was it said, look, let's take all of these people, all of these teams, and let's get them working together right from the start. So now in Sprint 1, we bring in the QA people, we bring in the deployment team, and we talk about what we're going to build. Now, does the QA have anything to test at the end of iteration 1? Maybe, maybe not, but what are they thinking about? They're thinking about how they're going to be testing. Does the deployment team have anything to deploy at the end of iteration 1? Hopefully. Probably not, but they're thinking about how to set up the deployment environment. This is what Agile did for application development. So the question is, what can it do for us as a company? And I want to talk specifically about Agile in a product development lifecycle, because a product development lifecycle looks an awful lot like what we had for systems development lifecycle. You start with marketing coming up with a new product, something really cool and ingenious. They move to a prototype and design phase, and they give it to some engineer or designer or architect, and they start building it, creating it. This is what it's going to look like. At that point, maybe we get the lawyers involved, because we better find out whether somebody's already making something like this, or if we violated a patent. Do we need to file for a patent? After everything gets kind of approved, then we move to manufacturing. We say, hey, we got this great idea. We want you guys to build this thing. And then finally, when manufacturing's done, they say, hey, here's this thing. We need you guys to ship it in logistics. just like the systems development lifecycle. Of course, what's the problem here? When you get into manufacturing, you may have designed something that's impossible to manufacture. Manufacturing may build something that's impossible to ship. So my proposal is that companies who really embrace Agile from end to end, from the boardroom to the mailroom, from start to finish in their life cycle, can compress these things down, bring all of these players together at the beginning of initiatives, at the beginning of product development, at the start of process reengineering, and start working with them all together. If you get logistics into the process from phase one, and when we're considering new products, logistics can help shape the design of that thing so that it's easier or more cost-effective to ship. Same thing with manufacturing. Same thing with legal. Legal can tell you right up front, this is a terrible idea. Company X has already got a patent on it. Does that make sense to people? Is that? Okay, just want to make sure you're all kind of. So that's the goal. The goal is to get everybody involved as early as possible, giving feedback as early as possible, engaging. So I want to talk about self-organization because it's an important part of Agile. In any Agile environment, we talk about self-organizing teams. It's one of the 12 principles. So what is a self-organizing team? Well, self-organizing team is one that has authority over its work and the processes that it uses, but not necessarily over who is on the team or what the purpose of that team is. Can we agree with that? Okay. So it's my philosophy that that statement is just as true whether you're an application development team, whether you work in a call center as part of a team, or whether you're in the executive boardroom as part of a team. Control over the work and processes. So a self-organizing culture takes that a step further. It requires humility, it requires trust, it requires, and most importantly, guys, it requires an understanding of shared goals. It is impossible to have a swarming approach and to be fearless in your approach to challenges if you don't understand what the goal, the end goal of your initiative or project is. This is a really important concept. The idea of understanding the goals at the end are critical. And think about whether you may know what your team's goal is. Do you know what your customer's goal is? Do you know what your department's goal is? Do you know what the company's goals are? As you work on a day-to-day basis. Regular feedback is important. In order to really take advantage of it, again, we want to be looking at successes and failures from top to bottom, everybody throughout the organization. We're inward and outward focused. We're looking not just at our team, but how our teams are impacting the people that we work with, other teams that we collaborate with, other customers that we work with. We need to have clear goals set out. How are we going to measure progress? It has to be more than one earnings call a year. It has to be more than a quarterly review. Feedback for our employees, for our management, for our executives has to be constant in order for an organization to be agile. It's an important deal. We can't just focus on our team, but also on how we work with other teams. Get feedback from that. Okay, so I've talked for quite a while at this point. I see some eyes glazing over. I'm going to ask you guys to do something for me real quick. I want everyone to stand up. This will be a very quick deal. I want you with me just 3 times. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Okay, sit down. Whenever I talk for too long, I get a little worried. We're going to do a little bit more talking, and there'll be some exercise at the end. But for right now, we're going to keep pressing forward. How you guys feeling? Any questions that I need to address in the room before we move on? Okay. We're going to move from why culture is important and what culture is to how we start to build an agile culture in our company. First and foremost, I think we've got to demonstrate agility. During my time at the Nebraska Department of Transportation, we implemented something called an enterprise transition community. It's a concept that Mike Cohn recommends in his book, Succeeding with Agile, which, by the way, if you're on an Agile team that's in flight, this is a great book to start looking at for how you can improve that Agile team. It's not a how-to book, how do you do Agile? It's how do you fix Agile once you start it. It's a fantastic book. The idea here is that we have a team that's focused on a department-wide or a corporate-wide enterprise adoption of Agile. The team is focused on how is our group, whether it's a department or the entire organization, how are we going to adopt Agile? How are we going to improve Agile? How are we going to change? This group at the Department of Transportation included both the CIO and the PMO because we needed that seniority on this team. It used Scrum to manage the change initiative that we were trying to put in place at the time. It uses agility to spread agility, and that's really the important thing. The sponsors need to demonstrate a commitment by actually participating in the process. How many of you have had a sponsor on your project participate in your Agile process? How many of you have worked with a manager who uses Agile in their work? 2 or 3, okay? Something to think about. So how does an enterprise transition community work? It's a small group, should be 10 to 6 to 12 people. It should include senior people in an organization in the organization that is making the transition. It's got to include senior people not just from your team or your department, but it should also include senior people from the departments being affected. And why is this important? Because, for example, an enterprise agile transition may include changes in positions or titles or job responsibilities, so you better get HR involved. It may include changes in pay scale as you try and hire, or new positions, so you better get your accounting and HR or accounting and finance involved. It might include new IT challenges, so you better get your IT and infrastructure team involved. They all have to come together because this team, it's got to provide a vision and the resources that are necessary for whatever transition you're trying to make, for whatever change you're trying to make. The team members need to use their seniority and their influence and their credibility to drive the change forward, to lay out a vision. They've got to define the goals for the transition, and those goals may change over time, and then they've got to communicate those goals out as the transition happens. And if you think, by the way, we're already in the midst of Agile, we don't need this, you're wrong. Because your Agile processes should be constantly changing and adapting. And the sphere that you work in probably is bigger than you realize. How tightly are your Agile initiatives integrated with the customers that you're working with? Do they involve all the parties, the IT teams, the finance teams, the marketing teams? So, before I move on, any questions about enterprise transition community? Yep.
Did we have this at Delnet?
No, not to the best of my knowledge. I've not seen one. Anybody seen something like this before? Yep.
Do we know if our RFP response team is following Agile methodology?
I do not know the answer to that. Does anybody else know?
Well, they do go through iterations. I mean, they built the response, and then it goes through, like, that lots of different people for
So it sounds like they are a little bit.
They do have an iterative process. They start out with like an outline and then go through that draft.
They've certainly been through a lot of iterations of responses, haven't they? Okay. I'm going to move on here. The next thing I want to talk about as far as how do we make this transition is training for everyone. Strong sponsorship of Agile transitions are key to the success. The training needs to happen at all levels of the organization. In the enterprise-wide transitions, this means even at the executive level. And when I think about this, when I think about who needs training, I say everyone. But if you're looking at your team, it's not just your team, it's also the customers that you work with, and it's also the managers that you work above, so that you can avoid the kind of scenario that we ran into at the Department of Transportation, where some executive made a decision not really understanding the balance that we had struck on the team, the agreement that we had come to. Sponsors must do more than just declare their support. This is a really important deal. And I think it's something that everyone probably could be doing better at. Sponsors must do more than just support it. They've got to actually demonstrate it. They've got to participate in the change. A checkbook-only commitment from sponsors and executives to Agile transformation is the greatest way to make sure that transformation fails. A checkbook-only commitment from management and sponsors will lead to Agile failure. So how does training work? We're talking about it before, training for the executives, the business, the partners, the customers, all employees, all employees. Nelnet does something awesome. When you get hired now, I don't know how many of you have been through this, but I started 2 years ago, and I went through this. They start their training for every employee with, I don't know if it's 30 minutes or an hour on Agile, on what Agile is. And then every employee leaves that and never talks about that training again. But it's awesome. It's a start. It's an introduction. The problem happens is that training cannot be a one-time event. Because why? Why can't it be a one-time event? Once you're trained, you should know what to do, right? If you use it, yeah.
Things are constantly evolving.
Every time your team changes, what happens? Yeah. Right? We go back from the storming, forming, storming, norming, performing. You go right back to the forming stage, right? So, ultimately, Agile training needs to be a little Agile too. It's got to roll with the agility. And you got to experiment with different options and figure out what works. So after you kind of come to that decision, how are we going to do, who needs to be involved, what are we going to do, how do we get training, what are the options for us? Well, here's where I'm at. Consulting or coaching, we have coaches here at Nelnet. That's a really awesome tool. It's a great resource for us to have. We should take advantage of that, but not necessarily limit ourselves to that. Because even as coaches, we can get a really narrow focus. We base on our experiences. We start to get to know people and individuals. We start to make assumptions. So outside people are helpful. Staff training and certification. How many people have a Scrum or some sort of Agile certification in this room? Yeah. And certifications are great. I mean, they don't tell you whether the person is an awesome expert in Agile, but what they do is they get you to look into some things that you might not have realized were even available to you, and get you thinking about it. There's conferences like this is one of the most awesome things I've ever seen a company do. This kind of thing. In fact, Billy and I have been talking about how we can branch out this camp concept to other things like SharePoint training, or potentially the ERP system, or maybe even ServiceNow. How do we get people together like this to share their experience and knowledge, to get to know one another? Because you guys all have a shared interest in something. It's Agile. Local user groups are good. Agile Link is an awesome one. I know you guys probably don't want to drive to Lincoln, but there's probably some here in Denver. And then other organizations are willing to share. Has anybody ever gone into another organization and observed their Agile process? Oh man, that's great. It's a great experience. When I was trying to figure it out for the Department of Transportation back in 2005, I traveled down to Carfax. Does everybody know what Carfax is? Carfax took a mainframe-based, really waterfall-driven process, and they turned it into a code factory based around extreme programming, used test-driven development, paired programming. It was really a cool deal. And when I went down there, I had all sorts of great ideas. They were really nice to show me everything. So that's cool. They're based in Columbia, Missouri, so they were pretty close to Lincoln, Nebraska. So, lastly, we're going to talk about how you become an Agile organization. So one of my things here is fake it until you make it, and what I mean by that is you heard me kind of bash on Agile methodologies earlier. They have a very important role in Agile adoption. You guys probably all thought I was crazy, and I printed off the wrong document to hand out to you. When you looked at it and you saw this cookie recipe in there, did anybody think Kyle was crazy when they saw the cookie recipe?
Just before that.
The cookie recipe had nothing to do with it.
Yeah. So this cookie recipe is a cookie recipe my wife made for me probably 15 or 20 years ago for the first time. It's absolutely delicious. Try it for yourselves. I got chastised in the comments in Madison and Lincoln that I didn't bring cookies. Just trust me, they wouldn't be the same after they've been sitting in my hotel room for 3 days.
They probably wouldn't make it out of your hotel.
There's possibility of that too.
I just want to point out in Lincoln, that's where you live. You could have brought cookies.
Yeah, in Lincoln I was busy putting together a breath presentation, so I couldn't do it. Also, I was going to say, the other thing here says, this is probably the most valuable thing you'll take away from my talk today is this cookie recipe. Take it with you. So here's what I want you to do. I want you each to carefully read that recipe. It's 1 page. It's pretty simple. Take a few minutes and carefully read through the recipe. If you don't have one, you can share with a friend, or they have some extras in the back, it looks like. Another 30 seconds, maybe. Okay, so let me ask you guys a question now. Has anyone ever had these cookies before?
Similar.
Somebody said similar. Okay. So you may know some of the answers to these questions. After reading the recipe, do you guys feel like you know how to make the cookies?
Yeah.
You feel like you could do this, work this recipe through? It's not super complex. There's only 3 steps in this making. Some of us are better bakers than others, I'm sure. Okay, so since you know how to make the recipe, you've read the instructions, who can tell me how these cookies taste? How do they taste?
Well, really sweet, a little hint of warm. It's like white chocolate, I have white chocolate. So I have a little
And how you're basing that on? And you've had those ingredients before?
Had them before.
Okay. So that, I mean, and that kind of gets to my point. The only way that you're going to know how they taste is to do what?
Bake them.
Make them, right? You got to walk through the recipe. You got to put them together, and you're going to make them. So let me ask you this: after you make them, assuming you like them, you're going to make them again. Are you going to use the recipe exactly as it's written?
You're baking.
Hmm?
You're baking. It's chemistry.
It's chemistry. Right. I've actually, yeah, you bring up a good point, because making cookies up in the mountain, or baking up in the mountains is a little bit different than baking in Lincoln, Nebraska. I've had that experience before, so. But I think the key thing is you might add a little more lime, you might add a little more sugar, you might like more nuts. It just kind of depends. You're going to tweak it to your preference, right? Okay. And that's kind of, where we're at too. Agile methodologies are really the recipes of our Agile experience. So let me move us on. You have the 12 principles on your desk here, or on your tables there. You've probably seen the 12 principles. How many people have seen the 12 principles before?
They saw them yesterday.
If they were here. But my version's a little different. This handout is a variation on those 12 principles that accompany the Agile Manifesto. These to me are the values that we should all aspire to as Agilists. I've never been in a project that does all 12 of them, so don't feel bad if you haven't either. They're aspirational. This one removes all language that's specific to application development, because I believe the Agile principles can apply to any business process. I want you guys to now read through this, and I want you, as you read through, you may be